Hello everyone and welcome in today's PECB webinar. My name is Gzim and I am the account manager for security portfolio at PECB, also the organizer of this webinar. I believe you all know that PECB organizes daily webinars in our 5 portfolios, and every week we organize a webinar on security portfolio covering different topics and areas. In this 30 minutes webinar we will hear about ISO 27001 and Section 6 planning. This topic will be hosted from PECB partner and trainer Mr. David Annex, who has worked for more than 20 years in the risk management field, managing a broad spectrum of consulting services and product solution. David has worked in the consulting field for 16 years and is the founder of SecuraStar, a niche ISO 27001 consulting firm in the United States, and the founder of ISMS Manager Software. I hope you will enjoy this webinar and find it very informative. If you have any question, you can write them in question box in the right-hand control panel, or you can use the option to raise your hand and we will answer to all of them accordingly. Please, David, you may continue now.
Okay, thank you, Jesem, and first I want to thank PECB for this opportunity to present to all of you one way to look at Section 6 planning within the ISO 27001 auditable requirements. Okay, today's webinar, we're going to quickly go through this. We're going to just have 30 minutes here, but we're going to quickly go through one way to meet those Section 6 requirements, primarily in the risk assessment management. Okay, this presentation is going to cover then in order, in a step-by-step process, risk assessment approach, one way to do it, asset inventory, risk assessment, risk treatment plan, and then finally the output is the statement of applicability. So before we're actually going to do this live for the first time instead of going through just a bunch of slides, so everybody can see a real process flow of how it works. Before we do that, we're going to go through 2 slides to kind of explain what's going on in a visual so that you can understand what that process flow is actually doing in real life. So this first slide here is what we call our ISO 27001 framework. This is a diagram that we put together at SecuraStar. We also use it for our software company. And this is just a diagram to explain the Section 4 through 10 requirements, okay, because as you all know, if you've ever looked at the ISO 27001 standard, there's no visuals in there, so it's kind of hard for people to understand what's happening. So just to explain this diagram here real quick, we don't own these requirements, but we put these into a visual for you and into a process flow so you can kind of follow along of what's actually happening here. So let's go through this real quick. Section 4 here is context of the organization. It has 2 main outputs. One is going to be the scope of registration. Okay, this is basically the information we're trying to protect. And then it's going to be any legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements that fall within that scope that will also be auditable. Okay. Then we're going to go to the leadership tab here. We're going to have information security policy. This is a high-level, executive-level policy and objectives set by management, okay? Not to be confused with low-level operational policies down here that are outputs of the risk assessment. 2 different things, okay? So this is a high-level objective up here, and this is also, we're going to, in this Section 5, we'll have what's called roles, responsibilities, and authorities. This is where management lays out who's responsible for managing the ISMS and taking care of the different policies, process, procedures, and things that have to be done in Sections 4 through 10. Okay, the part we're going to be covering today is going to be Section 6 planning here. That's the 3rd category, and this is mostly the risk management process. And so ISO 27001 requires a risk assessment approach, an asset inventory. This is an Annex A requirement, by the way. Risk assessment. Then we're going to go through risk treatment options, risk treatment plan, which is a requirement, and then lastly, statement of applicability here. A lot of companies get this part wrong that don't have a experience implementing ISO 27001, because you can only do a statement of applicability, and this is mapping to those ISO 27001 Annex A controls if you use this chronological order here, because the statement of applicability can only be done based on the two types of risk to the assets within the scope here, okay? And this is the only way that you can get this, which controls apply to you or not in Annex A based on those risk assessment. Okay, so that's what we're going to go over today. I'm going to just keep going here really quickly. We also have a support tab here, and some of the key components of this are going to be the training and awareness program. That would include a presentation like we are doing today. A control of documents is also a main requirement in this tab, and then there's a few other things here that we deal with, communication plan and some other things. The next section here is going to be Section 8, Operation. This is going to be mainly the outputs of the risk assessment here. So when we have current controls and additional controls that we add in the risk treatment plan, those things are all to protect this scope right here. Okay, so the outputs of this risk assessment here, based on the assets within the scope, are going to be the policies, processes, procedures, service agreements to your third-party vendors that touch your scope, and also a business continuity plan that's also based on protecting this scope right here. Okay, this is not a business continuity plan necessarily for the whole company. It's only for this information that we've defined in the scope. Okay, this operation phase, we're going to put all of these things into place and telling people what to do, that old do phase here, and then we're going to see if they're doing it. And down here in performance evaluation, we're going to actually monitor and measure all of those things. So you can see here, policies, process, procedures are just going to be monitored and measured down here. Business continuity plan, training and awareness programs from up here in support, objectives from the executive level policy. What does management want to see from us, right? Legal, regulatory, contractual requirements that are within the scope. So that's just right here. It's in the scope, and we're just, are we complying with this or not? Okay, and then we're going to build into those metrics, and that's just summing up these records so that we can provide it in a summary metrics for the management review. Okay, then there's also an audit program, and that's going to be a review of all previous audits and reviews to make sure we close out all nonconformities. We're going to audit service agreements, okay, and that's just right for operations, service agreements. We're going to audit those, internal audits, any external audits, and all of that's going to come into a management review. This is usually a 1 or 2 hour meeting to go over all of those evidences and records, sum it up for management, okay, and then what we're going to do as an output of that is we're going to actually have a corrective actions record of what's not working and what are we going to do about it to fix it. And this is a continuous improvement cycle, okay? And as you can see here, we kept it in the spirit of Plan, Do, Check, Act, even though Plan, Do, Check, Act was done away with in the update of the standard in October 2013, okay? So it used to do Plan, Do, Check, and Act here, and they've done away with that, but we've kept that in the spirit of sections 4 through 10. Okay, now let's break down section 6 because that's what we're talking about today. These are the same exact tabs that are in section 6 in that framework we just looked at, but we're going to show you what's actually happening in here at a little lower level here. So let's start in order here. ISO 27001 requires a repeatable risk assessment approach that typically involves impact scale, likelihood scale, risk acceptance criteria that you set for yourself. Okay, ISO doesn't monitor what these are. None of these. You get to decide these for yourself. And risk treatment options. In this case, we typically use ISO 27005 risk treatment options, which I'm going to show you here in a little bit. Then let's move on here. We're going to have an asset inventory within the scope only the assets that are within the scopes, and that can be people, networks, cables, facilities, hardware, software, those types of things, okay, within the scope statement only. We're going to then perform a risk assessment on those assets within the scope, and then we're going to do risk assessment on the two types of risk. The two types of risk within ISO 27001 are the risk to the three properties of information, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, also known as CIA. And the other type of risk is going to be the risk of non-compliance. Okay? Underneath this umbrella are the two types of risk, which is what makes ISO 27001 such a great standard, because it's all encompassing. Okay? Within that scope statement, it's all encompassing. Okay? So we're going to go threats and vulnerabilities to assets within these two types of risks. Okay? So first of all, the risk of non-compliance can include two types of compliance: legal regulatory or contractual. Okay? In either case, legal regulatory or contractual has nothing to do with whether you have any risk to the three properties of information. They just say you have to do this if it falls within your scope. Okay? That might include, in the United States now, I've listed some common ones: FISMA, FedRAMP, these are government regulatory information security controls; HIPAA, which some of you might know is a healthcare requirements for information security in the United States; PCI, this is payment card industry; Cloud Security Alliance; COBIT, which is an information security framework that has to do with ISACA. It can be all kinds of things. It can be a contract between you and another company that you're providing services to, like Microsoft or Google or something like that. Okay, so that's the risk of non-compliance. The risk to threats and vulnerabilities to CIA, we typically use this process, but this is just one way to do it. And I want to make very clear here, ISO 27001 is a set of generic requirements. So this is typically how SecuraStar does it, or our software does it, and it's just one way to do it. There's hundreds of ways to do it, and that's why those generic requirements are in place, and it allows everybody some leeway. We're just going to go through how we do it today, because we typically do it, I should say, just as one example of what it looks like in that process flow. And we're actually going to go through a real process flow here after this slide. Okay, so what we typically do in this risk assessment process is we do one step here that does raw risk, and we basically do raw risk, which is threats and vulnerabilities to assets with no controls. And what we want to do here is use an impact and likelihood scale to come up with a risk value on a raw risk basis, no controls applied. Because how do we know we need controls if we don't have any risk? And the answer is we don't. So we're going to go through this process here. Then we're going to ask ourselves, is raw risk, the impact times likelihood, require us to put any controls in place at all? And then so we're going to ask ourselves, is raw risk at risk acceptance criteria? If it's not, we need to consider what the current controls are that we have in place to reduce this raw risk. And then we're going to add any current controls that our company is currently doing. And that's going to reduce the impact and likelihood to the raw risk. Then again, we're going to ask ourselves, after we consider those current controls we have in place, are we at risk acceptance criteria that we've set for ourselves? Again, ISO does not set this. This is something we set for ourselves. Okay? If we're not at the risk acceptance criteria, then we've got to go through risk treatment options. These are the 4 options from ISO 27005. I am going to show those to you in a second here, so I don't want to get into that right now. And then whatever we decide to do, we'll have one of those 4 options, we're going to add some type of control. This is called risk treatment here, okay? And then the last thing we're going to have left over after we treat risk is what's called residual risk. And this is the risk that executive management has to sign off on, saying they understand this is what the risk is left over, okay, and they have to agree to it. Now, you'll see here that I have 2 things in green here. One is the current risk. These are the current, and I'm talking about the low-level controls, right, like data encryption or criminal background checks on employees or something like that, okay? What we've done then is that we have to map these controls in the current, and then any controls we add in risk treatment to Annex A. Okay, and when we do that mapping to Annex A, we now know that those controls are applicable to our scope, and that is going to populate here the statement of applicability. Okay, you'll also see that through those steps, the raw risk current risk, and risk treatment, when we do this risk treatment section here, we can also then automatically do the risk treatment plan because we've gone through a step-by-step process here and we know what controls we're adding for risk treatment. And this is risk treatment is a requirement of ISO 27001, as is the statement of applicability. Okay, now we do one other thing typically is that we map these low-level controls here in these two current controls and risk treatment to Annex A, so we can also map this Annex A to, as the middleman here, you'll see we have this set as the middleman, to compliance requirements. Because oftentimes these compliance requirements sit on the same level as Annex A. They're kind of mid-level controls that you get to pick and choose which low-level controls map to it. So what we do here is we map these low-level controls in the risk assessment process to Annex A, and then we bring them over and we put them into these categories here by mapping the lowest level of Annex A to the lowest level of FISMA, or the lowest level of PCI, or the lowest level of Cloud Security Alliance, whatever it might be there. And so that's how we typically do it. And I hope that is kind of making sense to everybody here. Okay, and then of course the current controls and any added controls end up being policies, process, procedures, business continuity here. So these are only the controls that would be policy, process, procedures in the Section 8 operation that would apply to our scope. Okay, and that's the process flow. So let's look at it in real life now. I'm actually going to show you a process flow here in Section 6, Planning, and we're just going to go through one option of what can meet the generic requirements. Okay, so let's go through methodology here first. Okay, well, I have a little. Okay, and the rest methodology, this is how we typically lay it out, and this is just one option to meet those generic requirements. So in our system here, we typically lay out a methodology here that says this risk assessment methodology used is in accordance with ISO 27005. Now, some of you might be familiar with those generic requirements, is you could actually use any kind of risk assessment methodology, such as Octave, NIST, BITS, Mahari, all kinds of different risk assessment methodologies you can use. Okay, in this case, we're just going to use ISO 27005 guidance for how we're going to do that. We also have our steps built in here of how the risk assessment is going to work. Okay, so we're going to say we're going to identify the assets within the scope. We're going to identify the threats to those assets and any vulnerabilities that might exploit them. We're going to assess the business impacts to the organization, the loss of the three properties of insurance of information: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay, then we're going to estimate the value of risk using the formula risk value equals impact times likelihood. We're going to identify and evaluate the options for treating risks, right? Risk treatment. We're going to select the control objectives and controls for the treatment of risks. We're going to obtain management approval of the residual risk. We're going to obtain management authorization to implement and operate the ISMS, the do phase. This is now Section 8. And then we're going to prepare a statement of applicability. Which of the Annex A controls apply to us based on those two types of risk to the assets within the scope? Okay. And then lastly, we're going to list the definitions here of what impact means and what likelihood means. And you'll notice here that we use the same terminology in the standard. We don't call it probability and harm. One of the reasons we do that is just to establish a standard vocabulary within our company of what we're going to use. Okay, impact scale. By the way, you can change this. This is just one way to do it. Okay, impact scale. You can, again, this is a generic requirement. You can do these in all kinds of different ways. We typically use a 1 through 5 scale, but you certainly can use a 1 through 3 scale, a 1 through 5 scale, a 1 through 7 scale, whatever you want. ISO doesn't require any specific one of those. Okay, we use 1 through 5 just for simplicity, and it seems to be a fairly well used number. Okay, and then it's typically low to high here, and then we can define this impact in all kinds of different ways. We can just do one category here and say this is what the financial impact might be to our clients if we were to have a loss of CIA or a non-compliance requirement. We could be fined, we could be sued, all kinds of things, right? Okay, so we can do a financial cost. If we want to, we can also do other categories: loss of income, credibility factor with our customers. We can have customer satisfaction or loss of customers. We can go through the legal cost, or what that might mean to us, all kinds of things, right? So there's a lot of ways to assess impact. It's just up to your organization to decide what those are, generic requirements. Okay, likelihood scale is typically a much simpler scale. It's just 1 to 5, or again, you could do 1 to 3 or 1 to 7 or whatever you want to. Typically, we just do low to high. This is less important to us because the impact scale is really what we're going to judge how we're going to treat that risk based on those different categories that we put together in the impact scale. That tells us how much we might lose, what the public embarrassment might be, what the other cost to the organization might be, and that's going to help us decide what controls to put in place, right, or how to treat risk. Okay, the next thing here is going to be risk treatment options. We typically just use the 4 options out of ISO 27005, but again, this is a generic requirement. It doesn't require you to use the ISO 27005 4 options. You can choose whatever you want to here, but we typically use the ISO 27005 options, and here they are: risk reduction, risk retention, risk transfer, and risk avoidance here, and we're just laying out here what the definition is. Okay, and then lastly, risk acceptance criteria. Because we're typically using a 5 times the 5 scale in our system, you can use whatever you want to, this is what it might look like. Okay, and so you can see here we have a 1 to 5 likelihood and 1 to 5 impact in this case, but we could do anything we wanted to: 1 through 3, 3 times 7. It can be all over the board, but this is just one way of doing it. Okay, and then you'll notice here in green we've put the risk acceptance criteria. We can change this to whatever we want to as well. The risk acceptance criteria is up to us as an organization to set. It just has to be defensible within ISO 27001. So we could change this to everything 8 and below could be green. Everything 15 and above could be red, high risk. That's up to us to decide just based on your impact and likelihood scale. Okay, but we're just going to leave this as is so I can show you the next steps here. Okay, asset inventory. Asset inventory here, you can do this a number of different ways. We're going to do this using asset types and asset categories. So we're going to start out with asset types here. As I mentioned to you, these are only the assets now that are within the scope. That information that you're certifying and you're protecting within the scope of the ISO 27001 certificate. Okay, so here are some list of asset types and categories: cables, compliance, hardware, software, networks, cables, facilities. All of these things are types of assets. What we're going to look at one here is software, and then we're going to do one here such as server databases. So how we've set this up here now is that these are going to map to the same threats and vulnerabilities to these asset types in the next category here, risk assessment. So what we're going to do here is keep these same asset types and categories that we have threats and vulnerabilities established for, and then we're going to just add assets here in the asset inventory. Okay, and let me show you one here that I already have filled out here: desktop, mobile devices. And this is just a sample asset inventory. There's a lot of ways to do an asset inventory. We can use specific assets like Dave Anders' computer or Dave Anders' laptops, but a lot of times we use a generic reference. We'll say all laptops in a specific location within the scope. Now that's just one way to do it, and what we're really trying to get to here is where are we going to put controls on place. So if we establish, after going through desktop, laptops, mobile devices here, if we actually end up going through the threats and vulnerabilities to this and we decide to do data encryption, okay, what we want to know here in the asset inventory is whether we list one laptop or laptops by individuals' names, or we just say laptops in Chicago, or in Denver, Colorado, or something like that. What we want to know is where does the data encryption have to be implemented, okay? And that's what we're really trying to get to here. So please keep that in mind when you do your asset inventory. It does not require individual assets. We can say all laptops in Denver, okay? And that's where the data encryption has to be on all those laptops in Denver, okay? And it's a way for us to know where those go, okay? A lot of times in organization, assets are changing all the time. Adding 3 laptops, getting rid of 3 laptops, those types of things. So we might want to be a little bit more generic here. The standard does not require you to say every individual laptop. Okay, that was my only point there. Okay, let's move on to the next section here, and I'll show you kind of how we do the risk assessment then. It's laid out in the exact same way. We use asset types and categories, and this is just one option of meeting those generic requirements. Please keep that in mind. And we can go down here to software, and let's do one here on server applications. And what we're going to have here is a bunch of threats and vulnerabilities to server applications within software. So let's go through one of them here. Inadequate system operation and configuration, non-existent or inadequate change management process. I'm actually not going to use that one because the answer to this one is the change management process, and I want to use one that has more different kinds of controls in there. So let's use one here, maybe this one here. Okay, and let's go through this process here. We have inadequate system operation and configuration. That's the threat. The vulnerability is non-existent or inadequate software testing and validation. The Annex A reference here is Annex A 14.2.1. What we're going to do is we're going to use this Annex A to help us find some controls to reduce this threat and vulnerability. Okay, we have to apply an asset owner here. So I'm just going to assign myself as the risk owner. This is a requirement, by the way, of the new standard. Then we're going to set this based on our impact and likelihood scale that we set up in the methodology or approach tab. And if you remember, we set that at a 5. Okay, we can set that at whatever we want to, but in this case we set it at a 5. So let's set this now. This is raw risk. If you see at the top here, this is raw risk with no controls applied. So we're just going to set a raw risk with no controls. Okay, now let's say that the raw risk is high and high. That gets us to a 25, and if you remember in that risk assessment methodology and approach we just looked at, we set anything above a 20 to a 25 as high risk. Now it requires us to list our current controls. And I want to go back here and show you something here. If we go back and say this is already at risk acceptance criteria, this threat and vulnerability, do we need to add any controls at all? The answer is no. Okay, and one of the common mistakes why we do raw risk here typically for our clients is because one of the mistakes they do here is they say, well, we're already doing data encryption currently, so let's just add that as a control that we're doing. And that's actually often a mistake because we have no risk to do data encryption or any other low-level control because the risk is already rated as acceptable. Okay, and so just because you do a control in your company doesn't mean you want to necessarily add it to your ISMS if you have no risk, because then that control becomes auditable and it becomes an audit failure then if you don't do it right. And then your clients can rely upon that control because you added it to your ISMS even though you had no risk. So careful here, don't just add controls if you don't have risk to your assets within your scope. Okay, that's why we go through this raw risk process to make sure we have risk first. Okay, now we have risk. Now list your current controls. So let's use this Annex A here as a guide, Annex A 14.2.9, and see what controls we might have that can reduce this. Annex A 14.2.9. Okay. And we have a couple controls that are options for us that may already exist in our current controls. So let's just choose one of these ones, and I can tell here with our code here, this means network security policy subsection 2.1 control 2.4 control number 1. Okay, and so now what we can do is we can look to see this is a current control of ours. Let's just add it and done. Now you can see we've already mapped these to Annex A, so in that diagram I showed you earlier, we can automatically populate the SOA with this security control. Okay, now we're going to re-rank this, our impact and likelihood scale here against this threat and vulnerability based on the reduction of the impact and likelihood from this control. Okay, so let's just say now that we're at a medium risk, right? A 3 times a 3. Okay, this means now our current controls are not down to our risk acceptance criteria based on our own scale that we set. And now we need to do something about it. This is called risk treatment. Okay, and now we're going to use those 4 options that we set up in our methodology. In this case, they come from ISO 27005. We can risk retention, that is, we can accept the risk as is above the risk acceptance criteria, or we can avoid it or terminate the risk. We can reduce the risk further by adding additional controls, or we can transfer the risk, like buying an insurance policy or outsourcing a data center or something like that, okay? Or even hiring a third party to deal with that risk. Okay, let's use risk reduction. This is typically what we do. And then that means we're going to add additional controls here. So now we can go back to that Annex A. Let's go back to the exact same category here, 14.2.9. And then we can actually see the control that we can add here. A lot of times there's 15 or 20 controls in here. In this case, this threat and vulnerability just has 2 controls listed in our system because we've mapped it to Annex A 14.2.9. So we just have 1 option here, and then we can add this to final selection, okay, and then done. Okay, now we've added our current controls, we've added our risk treatment, okay, and then we can actually reset now. This impact and likelihood becomes really important now because now we've treated risk, and what's left over now is residual risk, and that residual risk is what executive management has to sign off on. Okay, so let's re-rank that. Our goal is to be below a 5 because that's what we set as our risk acceptance criteria. Let's do 4 times a 4. I'm sorry, 2 times 2. That's 4. That gets our residual risk at 4, and that's what we think this control and this control get us after it's mature, not when we just add it, but when it's mature, this is what we believe this residual risk will be. Okay, and that ends that risk assessment process. Okay, and you can see here we just did this one down here. We started out with a 25. Our current controls got us down to a 9, and then we did some risk treatment at a 4. Now, the requirement now is to create a risk treatment plan for ISO 27001. So let's look at that same category, server applications, and pull up the one that we just did here. So we can do that right here in risk treatment. We can go to software, server database, okay, and you'll see here the 2 controls, okay, that we just added. Okay, and then what we have to do now in the risk treatment plan is we have to assign these to somebody who's going to do it, okay, and what the plan date is, and then of course we can attach an asset. I don't have any assets in here, but let's say it's all laptops in Denver or one of those assets that we had. But you have to add assets. When you go back to that asset inventory back here, you have to add assets for server databases. And once you add assets to that asset inventory, we can assign them to a control here. So the control is system security administration shall be executed only by authorized personnel with adequate competencies and training for the responsive functions. And then we're going to list which assets this control has to be applied to reduce that threat and vulnerability. Okay? And that's why I was telling you in that asset inventory, we can just say all laptops in a particular location because we just want to know where this control has to be applied. Okay, we might now have 4 or 5 different locations within the scope, but maybe only the locations with the laptops in Denver apply, and the other 4 don't apply. So that's where we attach the assets here. Okay, and that creates our risk treatment plan. Okay, and then that would be all risk. We'd show all risks on here to the auditor. Here's all the risks we have, here's who they're assigned to, and here's when the plan date is, and then we have to complete these tasks. And I don't have them done in here, this is just a demo. Okay, and then lastly we have the statement of applicability. The statement of applicability here is going to show us all the controls we have in place based on the two types of risk to our assets within the scope. So we can look at all of them here, the whole Annex A, and it will tell us now. This can be done in an Excel worksheet, so you don't have to do it in a software program or anything like that. This can be done in an Excel worksheet, and now you're going to tell the auditor which controls apply to you based on the two types of risk to the assets within the scope. Okay, and that's it. Okay, so we can go to one here. We did 14.2.9, and this is the one that we just did here. And this is telling us here that this applies to us because we just added those controls through the risk assessment process. Okay, and now we can see those controls, and here they are. Okay, and you can see the ones that we just ended up adding here. Here's the system security policy one that we just added, and here is the network security one that we said. And you can see here, one of these was a current control, and one of them was the control that we added in the RTP. Okay, and you can see now here in the statement of applicability, we need to tell the auditor why we have this control. We have this control because our asset category was server applications. We had a threat and vulnerability, here it is, inadequate system operation and configuration, and the vulnerability was non-existent or inadequate software testing and validation. We chose this control to reduce this threat and vulnerability to this asset. It's an RTP control, and you can find it in the system security policy, and we can even see who it was assigned to and what the plan date was. Okay, and this is just one way to do the statement of applicability. You can also do this in Excel. Okay, it's very commonly done in Excel. So that is the process. I know we're kind of running over time here, so let's take questions quickly for those of you that can stay on. And that is the process, and we can go back here to the PowerPoint slide so you can see it again a little cleaner. Here it is. Let's look at it one more time. This is exactly what we just went through in a real life situation. Okay, let's take questions here.
Okay, thank you, David, for your presentation. We have a few questions. I will read them and you will be able to answer to them. The first one is, can we use FAIR for risk assessment? There is a manual how to use FAIR with ISO 27005.
I don't know the answer to that. What I can say, because we don't use FAIR, if there's a standard written that says you can use it within ISO 27000, that's one's fine. But please remember, the risk assessment requirements in Section 6 are incredibly generic in the new version, the October 2013 version. So you could literally use just about anything. You can create your own risk assessment methodology completely and qualify for the standard. The problem, if you get too elusive on that and creating your own, is that you may be able to pass the generic requirements of ISO 27001 and get certified, but that doesn't mean that you're going to pass a client audit of you, because it has to be acceptable by your clients as well. So two different things here. Does it meet the generic requirements of ISO 27001? Yes, maybe, but it also has to be defensible to your clients, and that's one of the reasons you get ISO 27001 certified, is to give them reasonable assurance. And if they don't have reasonable assurance based on your unique risk assessment methodology, you're going to have problems passing those third-party audits. So careful here, okay? Try to use a methodology that's widely accepted and is not too complex, okay? And so when we talk about ISO 27005 or FAIR or Octave or NIST or BITS, remember now that we're really trying to get to adequately assess our threats and vulnerabilities to CIA and noncompliance and get to the end game, And the end game is, what controls are we going to put in place to mitigate those threats and vulnerabilities? We don't need to go through 1,000 threats and vulnerabilities typically to get to what controls we're going to have in the network security policy or the system security policy. We might only need to go through 150 risks, okay? So some of those methodologies are overkill, and that's my point. Some of those methodologies are overkill to get to the policies, process, procedures, those low-level controls in the operation phase. So don't go through Octave if you don't need to, because Octave is a huge risk assessment methodology. If you can use ISO 27005 or some other methodology that's much simpler, because remember now, the methodology has to be repeatable, okay? Okay, next question.
The second question is, how do you determine or calculate the residual risk? Is there a risk coverage from risk mitigation measures and calculation?
The residual risk, if you go back to how we calculated it there, is just what's left, the risk left over after those two stages. So let's look here. It's easier to see. Some of these things are easier to see in the diagram, and some are easier to see in the software version here. So let's go back here to risk assessment. Okay, let's use the one that we used. Server applications, I think that was right, or do we use server? I think we use server databases here. Okay. Oh, we use, is that right? Okay, well, it doesn't matter here. Let's just use one of these. There we go. This is the one that we did. Okay, if you see here, the residual risk is going to be left over after we treat risk. Now, it is possible, this is the residual risk right here, what's left over. So we have three phases, right? Raw risk, current risk. Now, what if current risk was down to risk acceptance criteria? Let's answer another question here. Okay, oops, let me get this down to a 2 and a 2 here in current risk, which means we're not going to do any risk treatment, where the current controls get us down to risk acceptance criteria. This is still residual risk here, okay? This is the risk that's left over. That's residual risk, even though we haven't treated it. Okay, we don't need to treat it. So this is the risk that's left over, and that's just what residual risk is. Okay, if we treat risk in this case, okay, then we add these controls, and in the end here, this is still residual risk. Okay, it's the risk left over after we've treated risk or current risk. Okay, all we're trying to get down to is risk acceptance criteria. Okay, hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. The other question is, Pillar supports a risk assessment on asset domains instead of individual assets. Sometimes risk assessment on thousands of assets is too cumbersome. Is there such a possibility here?
Can you repeat the first part of that again? Make sure I understand it correctly.
So the pillar supports a risk assessment on asset domain instead of individual assets. Sometimes the risk assessment on thousands of assets is too cumbersome. Is there such a possibility here? So this is the question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's what we had went through in the asset inventory here. There's no requirement to get into individual assets here, okay? Now, the auditor may want to dive down into how many laptops do you currently have in Denver or something like that. However, for the asset inventory, it is perfectly acceptable to use a higher level of assets, such as all laptops in Denver or all servers in Denver or all those types of a thing. But we do have to be specific on certain things occasionally within that audit. Okay, so yes, again, the goal here is to decide where controls are applicable. And as you know, laptops and some assets, especially in large organizations, are changing on a daily basis. So we couldn't possibly maintain individual assets in here on a daily basis, because we could be adding 3 people every day for a large organization that had 30,000 people. Okay, so it wouldn't make any sense to do it that way.
Okay, we have another question. It says, how can we reliably determine the decrease in impact or likelihood by applying a particular control? Your example went from 5 impact, 5 likelihood to 3 impact to 3 likelihood, but that particular control might have been ineffective or actively circumvented.
Right. The risk assessment that we go through is only a best guess, okay? All we're doing here is trying to make some type of repeatable, defensible decision about what we think a control impact will, or I should say reduction will be on impact and or likelihood. Okay, so it's just the best guess. And one of the reasons ISO 27001 does this and makes these generic requirements is because every organization is different. For instance, an organization that does secure conference rooms with no computers can get certified to ISO 27001 because the information they're trying to protect is actually people speaking in a room, no computers applied. Now, what would a firewall be worth in that, for instance? They have no computers. They're just doing secure conference rooms. Absolutely certifiable in ISO 27001. And so if you said, well, we have a firewall on our computer at the front desk, well, it makes no difference to the reduction of risk for the risk that's happening in that conference room. Okay? Now, a firewall to someone who has a software product, software as a service online 24/7 worldwide, what do we give the value of that firewall? Well, we might rank that as being worth a 5 reduction or something like that. So those controls only depend on what your scope is, what your assets are, what your threats and vulnerabilities to those assets are, and how your business is set up. Okay, and it's just a best guess. That's all we can do. Best guess. You can't go to Annex A or ISO 27002 and say, well, hey, if I put this control in place, it's worth 3 points. It doesn't work like that. We just have to make a best guess, guesstimate of what we think the value of that is, and it has to be defensible.
Okay, we have another question. Is there a maturity factor that can be applied to controls? For example, include effectiveness to the control.
There is. We typically use, now this is what we use, but there's a lot, but again, generic requirements here. There is no requirement in ISO to put a maturity scale in place, okay? However, we typically use a CMMI scale here, and I'll show you here. If we process a task, we typically use a CMMI scale here: non-existence, ad hoc, repeatable, define, manage, optimize. That's what we typically use. However, again, you can use whatever you want to if you want to measure improvement. Okay, but as you know, all of the ISO 27001 management systems are a continuous improvement process. So the auditor should be looking on years 2 and 3 and 4 in your certification for improvement, and one way to show them that is to have a scale. Okay, but again, generic requirement for continuous improvement. You can decide how you want to measure maturity as yourselves in any scale you want to use, but a CMMI is a very typical one that's used.
Okay, and we have the last question. This is, how is likelihood calculated? Also, a loss effect caused by realization of a risk may cause secondary risk, which may or may not cause secondary effects. An evaluation of these.
I'm going to have you read that one more time because that was quite long. Can you read that one more time, please?
Yes, he's asking about how is likelihood calculated. I mean the likelihood that you implied before.
Okay, the likelihood that we typically use is a very simple one. I'll show you here what we typically use, but as I mentioned, you can do this any way you want to. ISO does not have a set way to do likelihood. Okay, we typically use a very simple scale here, just low to high, but you certainly could, if you wanted to, within the generic requirements, do all kinds of other columns here if you wanted to define likelihood differently. Okay, generic requirement. There is no right way to do it, okay? But there is common ways that are done it, and we typically don't do, we do very little here, just low to high. Okay, up to you.
Okay, thank you, David, for giving us this highly informative presentation. I believe the attendees had the chance to learn many new things today, and I suggest you to take time and see our future webinar that we will be hosting. Next Wednesday, we will host a webinar topic, which is called Web Application, how penetration test can improve your risk assessment. But you can take time and see our website, www.pcb.com, on webinar section to register for our future webinar. Thank you once again and hope to meet you soon in our future webinar.
Thank you all.
Thank you.